Chautauqua is made possible by the Maryland Humanities Council, Montgomery College, and the National Endowment for the Humanities.
I'm Angela Rice Beemer here at the Germantown campus of Montgomery College for a living history program called Chautauqua. Chautauqua programs are both informative and fun. Scholar actors perform first-person accounts of very important people in history. Our theme is the War of 1812 in Maryland, and tonight's Chautauqua character wrote the lyrics to our national anthem during the fierce Battle of Baltimore. Tonight's Chautauqua character is lawyer and poet Francis Scott Key.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can everyone hear me? I think you can all hear me. I would like to begin my remarks this evening by reciting a poem to you. I'm going to put this hat down over here. It's good. This is something I wrote quite a number of years ago. When the warrior returns from the battle afar, to the home and the country he nobly defended, oh, warm be the welcome to gladden his ears, and loud be the joy that his perils are ended. In the full tide of song, let his fame roll along. To the feast-flowing board let us gratefully throng, where mixed with the olive the laurel shall wave, and form a bright wreath for the brows of the brave. Does anyone recognize those words? I wrote that verse and three others with it on the occasion of the defeat of the Barbary pirates off the North African coast in 1804 by the American Navy. For a number of years, the powers of Europe, France, England, Spain, and the United States paid tribute to the Barbary pirates on that north coast of Africa in order to gain access to the Mediterranean Sea. And in 1804, President Jefferson decided that our nation would no longer pay that tribute. He sent the Navy, and the Navy swiftly defeated those pirates. And in that victory, I wrote those words. And I entitled those words, I called those words, those verses, Song. And I had a song in mind. And now I should like to sing for you the second verse. Columbians, a band of your brothers behold, who claim the reward of your heart's warm emotion. When your cause, when your honor urged onward the bold, in vain frowned the desert, in vain raged the ocean. To a far distant shore, to the battle's wild roar, they rushed your fair fame and your rights to secure. Then mixed with the olive, the laurel shall wave, and form a bright wreath for the brows of the brave. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I must tell you that I'm tone deaf. And whenever I gather the family together on Sunday for church, or I should say not whenever, but when I do, my wife, Polly, always asks me, Frank, don't sing in church today. I wrote those words some years before I wrote another song with which I know you are familiar. I called it The Defense of Fort McHenry. You know it as the Star-Spangled Banner. It was written in the midst of a war we Americans call the War of 1812. It was written in the year 1814. It may surprise you to learn that I who wrote that song opposed that war when it was declared on June 18th, 1812 by an act of Congress. I thought that the objective of defeating Great Britain was a foolish one for such a young nation as ours. I thought that the objective of acquiring Canada for the United States was wicked. Now, I say this out of no disloyalty, I felt it at the time, out of no disloyalty to the United States. Like yourselves, I am a proud American, and I am a proud son of Maryland, raised in the rolling hills of Frederick County, sired by a father who fought in the Revolution to gain our nation's independence from Great Britain, raised by a mother who was a devout Christian, an exemplar of charity and gentleness. And in my chosen career of the law, I had the aid and encouragement of an uncle who, though he fought to maintain our allegiance to the British Crown, yet was he throughout life a friend to me. By 1812, I had been married for 10 years, and Mrs. Key and I had at that time been blessed with 5 of our eventual 11 children. I don't know why it is, but that always gets a reaction. I feared that war would further harm the legal business that I carried on in Georgetown. It had already been harmed by an economic embargo employed by Mr. Jefferson when he was president, and other methods of coercion against the French and the British. Our trade was in decline for several years prior to the War of 1812. My legal business was in decline as well, and I thought that this war would further hamper it. I feared for the safety of my family and our home, and yet this war was declared. The war hawks in Congress, Mr. Clay, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Felix Grundy, to name but a few, all sought to acquire Canada for the United States. Of course, they wanted to take it away from Great Britain, for Canada supplied many of the raw materials with which the British could prosecute war. And it is true that during their war with France, which had been going on for more than a decade, almost without interruption, it is true that they confiscated American trading vessels. They impressed American sailors in their navy. And yet, it is also true that the French were committing the same kinds of depredations against our nation as the British. It did not seem to me that declaring war in 1812 against Great Britain justified attacking a nation whose people had committed no harm against us. And by that I mean, again, the Canadians. And yet, this war was declared. Now, again, in 1812, the United States were a weak nation. The United States were not respected by the powers of Europe. And the United States were in a very difficult position vis-a-vis this war between Great Britain and France. We had language and cultural ties to Great Britain which were obvious to everyone. We had had a treaty with the French during our Revolution and after, and of course the French were quite important in the ultimate victory that the Americans gained at Yorktown in 1781. And both nations wanted our allegiance in their war against the other. And the United States wished to maintain its neutrality in this war. It also wished to continue to trade with both nations. Ours is a trading nation. Our principal trading partner is Great Britain. And so here we are, caught in this war, having our ships confiscated, our sailors impressed by both nations. And moreover, in Ohio and in the Michigan and Indiana territories, Indians are incited against our settlers by the British. Of course, the United States had many legitimate complaints against that powerful nation and against the French. But again, I say, we were in no position to prosecute a war. In 1812, the American Navy consisted of but 16 or 17 ships. The British had over 200. Our army on paper, 10,000 men on paper. The British had 250,000 men in their army. In the name of economy, during Mr. Madison's administration and that of his predecessor, Mr. Jefferson, our coastal defenses had been allowed to deteriorate. Money was not put into them, as perhaps it might have been. And so it seemed to me that this was indeed a foolish war, and there was a wicked motivation in it as well, to take an unoffending people and bring them within the confines of our own nation. But this war was declared. In 1813, Great Britain had finally defeated Napoleon. And this allowed the Brits to turn their attention now onto the United States. They had defeated a very powerful adversary in France, in Napoleon, and now they could deal with a minor irritant. That's what we were to them. Something of a minor irritant. Maybe minor is too strong a word, but certainly we were an irritant, and we were really no threat to Great Britain in their eyes. And so in the spring of 1813, this is some months after that declaration of war in 1812, in the spring of 1813, the British send ships. They blockade the Atlantic coast of the United States. They send ships into the Chesapeake. They threaten towns all along the watershed. We all know, do we not, of the attack on Havre de Grace, on Georgetown, on Frederickstown, the attack at St. Michael's, fortunately repulsed there. There was a general climate of fear and apprehension in the Chesapeake region in 1813. And everyone in the region knew that Baltimore would be a target at some point during this war, unless the United States were successful in winning the war beforehand. In August, I correct myself, in July of 1814, I joined Major Peters' artillery in Georgetown in this climate of fear and apprehension. I believed it was my duty as a citizen to work for the defense of my community. But I discovered in only a fortnight, in only a few weeks, that I was not a person of a military caste, and I resigned. But just 1 month later, it became quite obvious that the British were now bound to attack the capital of the United States, Washington City. They did this in retaliation for the attack in 1813 on the Canadian capital, York, which you know today as Toronto. But they did this in retaliation for the attack, the American attack on the Canadian capital. In the days leading up to the attack on Washington, I rejoined the infantry, and when Bladensburg was threatened, I was there with General Winder and Secretary of War Monroe, and the President was also just a short distance away. I knew the lay of the land well enough that I thought that I could advise the Secretary and the General as to the disposition of troops, and I enthusiastically did so. But as I believe you all know, what happened at Bladensburg was one of the great humiliations of the American military. It was a rout. As soon as the Congreve rockets of the British began firing, as soon as those redcoats came into view near that Bladensburg bridge, all the Americans who were in Bladensburg to defend it turned tail and ran, including the President of the United States and including he who is now before you. We ran because we knew that we were facing a force that would be very difficult for us to defeat. Now, the British had used as their base of operations prior to the attack on Washington a community in Prince George's County, Upper Marlboro. And there they met with an American doctor, Dr. William Beans. He was the leading citizen of that town. It was said of Dr. Beans that no fence was considered truly aligned until he cast his eye upon it. No tree could be removed from the town square unless he gave his permission. The British knew their man. They knew that he was a gentleman as well as a leading citizen. And so they treated with him. I say treated because, of course, they had the upper hand. They met with him, that is to say, General Robert Ross and Admirals Sir George Cockburn and Sir Alexander Cochrane. They met with him, and they struck a gentleman's agreement. They would camp in and about the town of Upper Marlboro with their troops, and no harm would come to those troops so long as the people of the town did nothing to inhibit the movement of the British troops. And this agreement held throughout the attack on Bladensburg and on Washington. But during those attacks, there were casualties on both sides. The British suffered several casualties. Several officers were wounded. And these wounded officers were brought back to Upper Marlboro, where they had so recently camped, to be treated. Now, I have not had much conversation with Dr. Beans on this point, but I have heard that he personally attended to several of these British troops. Be that as it may, these British officers were cared for. Their wounds were dressed. They were given food and drink. They were given a place where they could rest. And they wrote letters to their loved ones back in England, commending these Americans for the care that had been given them, commending Dr. Beans. The letters of which I speak will come back into my narrative in just a few moments. It also seems that after the attack on Washington, several British troops decided that they would create havoc in Alexandria And then they decided that they would like to create some havoc in Upper Marlboro. And these troops came into Upper Marlboro and very soon began threatening the townspeople, threatening wives and daughters, threatening property. Dr. Beans was sitting in his summer garden, enjoying the company of some friends one afternoon in August, when he heard a commotion, and he went out to investigate. And he was told by different people that there were British soldiers causing havoc, creating disturbances, threatening people. And so, Dr. Beans, being this leader of his community, rounded up a posse, found these marauding soldiers, and had them arrested. He placed them in a jail. And as luck would have it, one of those officers, one of those soldiers, escaped. And he made his way back to his commanders, who were now located with their ships on the Patuxent River. And this now freed captive British soldier, informed General Ross and Admirals Coburn and Cochrane that he had been arrested by Dr. Beans. And when the general and the admirals heard this, they felt that a gentleman's agreement had been violated. And they were very angry indeed, and they sent troops to Upper Marlboro, to Dr. Beans' home, and in the middle of the night, they arrested him. They burst through his door. They ran up his stairs. They found him in his bedchamber. They forced him to get himself up out of bed, dress himself as quickly as he could, and then they forced him to ride 35 miles on a cadaverous horse to a ship lying there on the Patuxent, where he was bound hand and foot and thrown into the hold of one of those British ships, treated like a common criminal by officers and crew alike. Well, you can imagine with what lightning speed the arrest of Dr. Beans spread throughout the town of Upper Marlboro and the surrounding communities. Why, just the next evening, I was locking up my home in Georgetown, closing it up, shutting the shutters and so forth, getting ready to retire, when I hear a knock on my door. I open the door, and who do I see but my wife's brother-in-law, Richard West, a resident of Upper Marlboro. He, with the news that Dr. Beans had been arrested. And he related to me the circumstances of the doctor's arrest as I have related them to you. Now, I had been practicing law in Georgetown for many years, by 1814, and I was considered to be, among my peers and within the public generally, to be one of the best advocates in court among all the lawyers. And of course, I knew President Madison. And so West suggested, urged, that I should go to the president and ask him if I might not be given the task of negotiating for the release of Dr. Beans. I heartily agreed to do so. I knew Dr. Beans. He was quite familiar to me. We are both communicants of the Episcopal Church. And he is distantly related, though I do not recall how, he is distantly related to my great uncle, Dr. Upton Scott, who was the physician who attended my mother on the occasion of my birth. And so there is this familiarity between Dr. Beans and me. And I knew him to be a good man. And I believed that his arrest was unjust. And so I heeded West's advice, and I went to the president the very next day. And he agreed that I should go on that mission to negotiate for his release. Now, the president had his own motivations. He was the head of the Democratic Republican Party. He was also the head of the government. And after 2 years of war, matters did not look very good for the United States, and there were many people who complained that perhaps he was not such a good president after all, and perhaps he was not the right man to prosecute a war, and perhaps the Democratic Republican Party was not the right party to be at the head of the government. And most of all, he did not wish to see any other civilians arrested during the course of this war, no matter how much longer it might last. Those were his reasons for seeking the release of Dr. Beans and sending me on that mission. My own motivation was that I conceived it to be my Christian duty to render aid to a man whom I believed had been so grievously wronged. I conceived it to be my duty to God to seek this man's freedom. And so I was instructed to travel to Baltimore and there to meet with the American prisoner of war exchange agent, a man named John Skinner. John Skinner had with him the letters of those British officers whose wounds had been treated at Upper Marlborough, and we intended to use those letters to gain Dr. Bean's freedom. We set sail from Baltimore on September 5th. A few days later, we met the British fleet at Tangiers Island off the coast of Virginia. They were aware of our presence. We boarded His Majesty's ship, the Tonnant. We were greeted by the admirals, by the general, and by the junior officers of the fleet, and we were invited to dine with them in the captain's cabin that very afternoon. The meal was quite good. The conversation was sprightly, gentlemen speaking with gentlemen. But when we came, Mr. Skinner and I, to our purpose, that of seeking the release, the freedom of Dr. Beans, Admiral Coburn stood up, slammed his hand down on the table, and insisted that Dr. Beans should swing from a yardarm in Nova Scotia before the month was out. I argued that Dr. Beans was an elderly man of 65 years, was a scholar, and most important, was a gentleman like themselves, and did not deserve such treatment at the hands of other gentlemen. My pleadings fell on deaf ears. But Mr. Skinner decided that now was the time to present those letters from those British officers. And he gave them to General Ross. And as General Ross perused the letters, he decided, on reading the sentiments contained within them, to release Dr. Beans to the custody of Mr. Skinner and myself, despite the protests of the two admirals. And within a very short time, Mr. Skinner and I were in the hold of that ship, telling Dr. Beans that he was soon to be a free man. But we had to temper that happy intelligence with yet more news that now the British had decided that they would attack the city of Baltimore, a den of pirates, they called it. A den of pirates, for during the course of the war, American merchants, using their own ships, committed acts of piracy against the British Navy and the British Merchant Marine and caused a great deal of destruction, confiscating British ships, having them condemned, robbing British merchants of millions of pounds in revenues and property. And the British, as you can imagine, did not take kindly to that, and they were going to teach the Baltimoreans a lesson. They intended to burn Baltimore down as they had burned Washington. Now keep in mind, Baltimore was the third largest city in the United States at the time. Imagine what the destruction of Baltimore would have meant to the people of the United States. Imagine what that would have meant to the economic prosperity, not only of people in Maryland, but in the entire nation. Mr. Skinner, Dr. Beans, and I discussed the situation, knowing that there was no way that we could affect any outcome. But there was one thing that we could do, and there was one thing that I requested when I knew that we would be forced to watch this attack. I requested of General Ross that Mr. Skinner, Dr. Beans, and I be placed back on the cartel boat on which Mr. Skinner and I had set sail from Baltimore, so that during the attack on this city, which meant so much to all of us, we would be, in effect, on American soil. And so that little cartel boat was tethered to His Majesty's ship, the Surprise. We were placed on it under guard. And within a very short time, this small British fleet of some 20 ships, I believe it was, made its way up the bay to the Patapsco River, within a few miles of Fort McHenry, which sat on a point south of the city, defending it. The bomb and rocket ships moved to within 2.25 miles of the fort, just in range of the fort. The Surprise and several other British ships, and of course the cartel boat on which I and my companions waited, we were perhaps another 2 to 4 miles back. The bombardment of Fort McHenry commenced in the early morning hours of September 13th, 1814. And within a very short time, our little cartel boat was shrouded in the smoke of the cannons of the British ships as they fired bomb after bomb at Fort McHenry. And the recoil from those ships roiled the waters around us and tossed this little cartel boat on which Mr. Skinner, Dr. Beans, and I stood, tossed it mercilessly, and we all feared for our lives. This bombardment, which began in a rainstorm, with a thunderstorm threatening at any moment, continued for the next 25 hours, the British guns very infrequently ceasing to fire. The fort firing its guns only when it felt it needed to. As the British advanced, the fort would return fire and the British would retreat. But we watched this bombardment of Fort McHenry and the city of Baltimore throughout that morning, into that afternoon, into the twilight, and into the dark night of the next morning. We watched and we waited through thick, acrid smoke, through low-lying clouds, through a misty fog which mixed in the smoke in the atmosphere. We watched and waited and listened as bombs exploded in the air and the Congreve rockets screeched across the night sky. From time to time, I would take up my telescope and I would look in the direction of the fort to see if the American flag still flew over it. But I tell you, there were many times when I could barely perceive any flag at all, for in the clouds, in the smoke, in the rain, it was very difficult to see what that flag was, which country it symbolized. But of course, I was reassured in the pitch of night that our flag still flew above that fort because the British continued to bomb. If they had been victorious at some earlier moment in the assault, their guns would have ceased firing. That was the logic of the situation. And yet this bombardment continued into the early morning hours of the next day, September 14th. And then just as suddenly, as those bombs had begun exploding in the previous morning, they ceased to be fired. The British guns suddenly stopped. A disquieting silence descended upon us. Stillness enshrouded the waters. No sound was heard from land, nothing from the fort, and the British ships simply sat on the water. This continued for several hours. The sun, in time, began to rise. It brought its rays of light upon the scene. The smoke disappeared. The clouds parted. And at around 9 o'clock in the morning, suddenly, a sound. It was the morning gun fired from Fort McHenry. It was the signal to the people of Baltimore that they were still protected by that fort. At Dr. Bean's urging, I took up my telescope yet again, and I looked in the direction of the fort. And in that sunlit sky, which was now clear and bright, I saw through my glass the largest American flag I had ever seen before. I am told that it was, in measurement, in dimension, 30 by 42 feet. It was a magnificent sight to see the American flag waving proudly, defiantly above that fort. I saw the flag of my country waving over a city, the strength and pride of my native state, a city devoted to plunder and desolation by its assailants. I saw the array of its enemies as they advanced to the attack. I witnessed the preparation for its assaults. I heard the sound of battle, the noise of conflict fell upon my listening ear and told me that the brave and the free had met the invader. Then did I recall that there were gathered around that banner men who had heard and answered their country's call. And though I walked upon a deck surrounded by a hostile fleet, yet was my step firm and my heart strong. Through the clouds of war, the vision of that banner still shone in my view. And with that vision came an inspiration not to be resisted. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming? Whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming? And the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? On the shore, dimly seen through the mists of the deep, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes, what is that which the breeze o'er the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses? Now, it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam, in full glory reflected, now shines in the stream. 'Tis the star-spangled banner. Oh, long may it wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country, would leave us no more? Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave, and the star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Oh, thus be it ever, when free men shall stand between their loved homes and the war's desolation, blessed with victory and peace. May the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must, when our cause it is just. And this be our motto: in God is our trust. And the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention. How was that?
I'm here with Alan Gephardt, who's just performed as Francis Scott Key. Thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure.
We enjoyed your performance very much.
Thank you.
How did you start doing this particular character? How did that come about?
That came about because I was raised at North Point, which is in Baltimore County. North Point was the beginning of the land attack in 1814 on September 12th. And I was raised in that community, went to that high school, was involved in theater. Many years after high school, I was riding my bicycle down what is now called North Point Road, past a historic structure which was attacked by the British, which at that time was owned by this teacher in my high school. And he waved me over and he asked me, would you like to be Francis Scott Key for this historical festival that we'll be doing at the park in a few weeks? And I said, yeah, sure, that'd be nice, because he knew about my background in theater in high school. So that's how he got started. And I did 5 minutes, a little 5-minute presentation, and it grew from there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now you've been doing Francis Scott Key since 1989?
1989, maybe 1988.
Somewhere around there.
Yeah.
How has your performance changed over the years?
Well, first of all, it's gotten longer. So I've gone from 5 minutes to, I a half an hour, 45 minutes is pretty typical. So I do a lot more background with the story of the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner, and I sometimes try to do more about his personal background, where he came from, who he was married to, how they met, his career, other interests that go beyond the law, other activities in which he was involved. So I do all of that. The other aspect of change would have to relate to my own changing over the years. So when I began doing Key, I was younger than he was when he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. And of course, I'm a good bit older than that. And so he's gotten older as I've gotten older. And I never talk about the events of 1814 as if they just happened. I always talk about them as if they happened a long time ago. Because by the time he would have been my age presently, yeah, that would have been a long time ago for him. Yeah.
You mentioned where he came from and his family background. Talk a little bit about Terra Rubra, where he's from.
Yeah, sure. Terra Rubra was a 2,000+ acre plantation that his father owned, John Ross Key, and it was in Frederick County at that time. Presently, what remains of that land is in Carroll County, but he was born in Frederick County. It was a typical farm or plantation of the day, multiple crop operation with livestock as well. And of course, John Ross Key was from a fairly prominent family. They were not perhaps among the richest families in the state of Maryland, but they were certainly well-to-do. So that's his background, Francis Scott Key's background. His father, again, was he fought in the Revolution. I've forgotten his rank now, but he fought in the Revolution to help win our country's independence from Great Britain.
And Key himself was born the year after, was it 1777?
1779.
79, okay.
1779,
okay.
Yeah. There was a debate at some point, I don't think the debate is any longer current, but there was a debate for some reason at some point that he was born in 1780. But most accounts say 1779, August 1st. And
how did he meet his wife?
He met his wife at a ball in Annapolis in her father's home. His wife was Mary Taylor Lloyd Key, and he met her in 1796 or 7 at a ball in her home, in her father's home. Her father by this time was deceased, but family still lived there. And it's the winter season. It's after the legislature has gone out of session, and so there's a ball, and he meets her there. She was 14 years old, and he was 18. And apparently he was just struck by her, thought that she was very beautiful and witty and had a good mind, and he began to court her, and he began to write poetry to her. I recited a poem earlier in the presentation, which, and I didn't follow up with this, I should have. He sent her this poem, and one day he's walking down Prince George Street in Annapolis, approaching her home, and she's in the second-story bedchamber window with her sister, and they stick their heads out the window, and she has curling papers in her hair. And as he approaches, and he's walking with a very good and handsome friend of his, Daniel Murray, as he approaches, Miss Lloyd calls down to him something to the effect of, "This is what I think of your poetry," because she'd taken the poems and ripped them into curling papers for her hair. But he continued to pursue her, and she obviously saw something in him, and they were married in that home in Annapolis in 1802, and that home's still there. It's the Chase Lloyd House now in Annapolis, so you can tour it.
That's a very interesting story. As you began the story, I was thinking, oh, Romeo and Juliet, not from the balcony, but from the window. And then she's got curling papers in her hair.
Right.
So it's a nice story.
Yeah.
Nice story. He was more than a man who just wrote poetry or was famous for the Star-Spangled Banner. Talk a little bit about some of the other things that he did. The lawyer, district attorney for Washington, D.C.
Sure. He was a practicing lawyer from an early age. He'd gone to St. John's College in Annapolis, got his bachelor's degree when he was 17 years old, and then his uncle, Philip Barton Key, was very influential, first in getting him educated at St. John's, persuaded his parents, you really should send that boy to a formal college, and so they did. But then later on, Philip Barton Key, very influential in persuading Francis Scott Key to pursue the law. And so Francis Scott Key studied the law under his uncle and another gentleman, Judge Jeremiah Townley Chase. That's the way it was done in his day. It was an apprenticeship system. There were no law schools. So that's what he did. So he practiced a variety of law. He didn't specialize in any one particular kind of law. There was property law. He worked a lot for the Land Office, the United States Land Office, trying to resolve disputes over land claims, over parcels of land that were sold multiple times to multiple people. And so there are conflicting claims. And so he was involved in a lot of litigation trying to straighten those kinds of things out. He also, I think this would probably be interesting to the audience, argued on behalf of enslaved people or free black people, and he also argued against them. It's because he is the client of the one party or the other, but he's involved in those kinds of cases as well. He becomes, as you noted, the district attorney of Washington in 1833, as many years after the Star-Spangled Banner, appointed by President Jackson, and remains in that office for 8 years into the term of Martin Van Buren. When, in I think it was 1835, President Jackson was walking through the rotunda of the Capitol following a funeral of a congressman, a young man approaches the president, who's arm in arm with, I believe, 2 other gentlemen. And this young man approaches the president and pulls a gun on him and tries to fire it, and it misfires. It doesn't do anything. Pulls another one out, same thing. And it's at point blank range. I mean, it's really, he's within a few feet of the President of the United States. Easily could have killed him had those guns fired. And of course they didn't. And Jackson, who was nearly 70 at the time, still strong, just lunges out at this man and begins to strike at him with his cane. Had to be restrained, and as the district attorney of Washington, Key had to interview this man in the Washington jail. His name was Richard Lawrence, and he was just clearly insane. He believed that he had some connection to the British royal family, was the rightful monarch, believed that somehow or another Andrew Jackson, as the President of the United States, was a usurper of British territory, was really quite mad, and so was not prosecuted for the attempted assassination of the President, but was placed in an insane asylum for the rest of his life. Those are two
So what are some
stories.
of the high and low points of his time as district attorney in Washington?
Well, that's a good question. And I really don't know enough about his career. I tried to do some research in that line when I was in graduate school, because I actually wanted to do a thesis concerning his legal practice. One of the problems with, as was explained to me at the time, was that, or is that, the cases are not filed according to the attorney. They're filed according to the litigant. So you'd have to figure out who the litigant is in order to see if it's connected with Francis Scott Key. So studying his legal career was, I couldn't do it.
So that brings up a good point about the research that you are able to do. Where are some of the sources that you go? For instance, if someone wanted to find out more information about Key, where could some people go? Where could they go?
The best place to go to is the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore. They have a large collection of papers relating to Francis Scott Key, many of them letters written in his hand. So you get to read letters to his wife, to his children, to other family members, to friends, to some of his clients, to members of the Episcopal Church. He was a vestryman in his church in Georgetown. He was also, he attended the annual and the triennial conferences of the Episcopal Church, very involved in that. And you can read some of that kind of thing as well. So there's a great store of information At the Maryland Historical Society, there are there's a fairly good collection at the Frederick County Historical Society, a few things at Carroll County, and also at Talbot County, interestingly enough. Yeah.
So that's good. So people could do their own research if they wanted to.
Yeah, you can see receipts for things that he purchased over the years, you know. It's interesting.
Did he get a chance to meet Ross? Because in my trying to, Major General Robert Ross, because in my research, at one point they had Ross dying before he got to the Battle of Baltimore, and at other points they had him on the ship that meeting with Key. So what is the real story?
He met Key before the Battle of Baltimore. Yeah.
I see.
So he was, I guess he was killed just a couple of days after meeting with Key. I mean, Key left on September 5th. I believe they arrived, if I remember correctly, they arrived at the British fleet on the 7th, negotiated, and of course the bombardment begins on the 13th, but Ross was killed on the 12th. So they did have time to meet.
You brought up another interesting point in your presentation about the gentleman's agreement up in Upper Marlboro. So was it that the British did not really plan to burn Washington? Was it the dissolution of the gentleman's agreement or the perceived?
No. The gentleman's agreement of which I speak is that between Dr. Beans and the British officers, Ross, Cochrane, and Coburn. No, it was, I think Coburn was actually quite determined to burn Washington. And actually Ross did not want to do that. He thought it was bestial, barbaric to do such a thing. You know, I guess you might say that he did not believe in an eye for an eye, right? We had attacked York, the Canadian capital. We had done some destruction there. But he didn't believe that that justified the British doing the same thing in Washington. So Ross did not want to do that, but Coburn was determined to do it, and it was done.
You mentioned, well, we've just got one more minute, but very quickly, Key wrote some poems that were turned into hymns, is that correct?
That's right.
Well, talk a little bit about
that very briefly. Oh, I don't know how well I'm prepared to talk about that right now. Lord, Before Thee We Bow is one that has been in Episcopal and I believe Methodist hymnals for, whatever, 175 years now. And the other is, what I know of it is a hymn for the 4th of July. And, you know, if I had the lyrics in front of me right now, I could say, oh yeah, you will recognize these lyrics. Or if we could do the tune, you'd recognize them. They're fairly familiar. But off the top of my head right now, I can't speak more intelligently than that.
That's okay, because people can go out and research it on their own.
Yeah.
And that's one nice things about Chautauqua. Yeah, you can plant the information and then we can research all
exactly,
here.
yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. We really enjoyed it.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us. You've been watching Chautauqua, the War of 1812 in Maryland. I'm Angela Rice Beemer, and for all of us here at the Germantown campus of Montgomery College, good night.